Hi, my name is Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I thought I would do a review of Sorrow and Bliss by Meg Mason. So this is on the Women's Prize shortlist this year. I read it a month or two ago after it made the long list, and I actually DNF'd it at that point. I read about 70 pages and I DNF'd it partly because I just wasn't quite into the narrative style, but also because it is a book that looks at mental illness and I wasn't sure if it was a book I wanted to read at that point in time. Since then it has made the shortlist, and I have heard other people speak very highly of it, and I wanted to give it another go, and I'm pleased that I did. So first of all, I'll just say that I will later on in the video be going into spoilers because I want to talk about some of the stuff that happens later on in the book, but I will clearly let you know before we go into spoiler territory, so you can click away if you want to. So this is a book about Martha, who is about to turn 40, and at the start of the book her husband Patrick leaves her, so she ends up having to move back in with her mother and father. Martha struggles with her mental health and has done so for a very long time. There is a sentence near the start of the book that I just wanted to read out because I think it's a great sentence. It says, "Unless I inform you otherwise, at intervals throughout my 20s and most of my 30s, I was depressed, mildly, moderately, severely, for a week, 2 weeks, half a year, all of one." We learn that Martha has collected diagnoses from the numerous doctors that she's seen who've given her various prescriptions for different medications, and nothing's quite worked for her. And now Patrick's left her, she's back at her parents' home, and she's not doing too good. What this book does really well is it merges humour with looking at quite serious issues. And I always think humour must be difficult to get right in a book because humour is so very personal. So I can imagine some people not getting on with it for that reason, and it also has a very distinct voice as well. But for me the humour worked for the most part. I did laugh out loud on a couple of occasions, but it also made me cry as well, which, like, both of those things don't happen that often to me when I'm reading a book, and it's very rare for both things to happen as a result of the same book. So I thought that was very well done. We learn about Martha's sort of backstory. We learn about her first husband, who by all accounts was not a very nice person, their separation, and then her sort of meeting Patrick, them getting together, getting married, and sort of what's happened to their relationship now. What I think this book does really well is it's not so much about the specific mental illness that Martha has. The focus is on the impact of that mental illness on Martha and on her behaviours and on her relationships with other people, and the impact on those close to her. And I think that's really well done in this book. And it touches on themes of, well, sort of the intersection between, I guess, personality, identity and mental illness, and how all those things can impact on the other, and how and if those things can stand separate from each other, or if they will always be interlinked in some way, which I think's quite interesting anyway. I do want to now, I think, go on to some spoilers. So this is your warning, click away now if you don't want to know anything that goes on in sort of the second half of the book. So, spoiler time. So Martha ends up seeing yet another doctor, and this doctor says to her, "Have you ever thought that you might have X condition?" And in the book it's written as just sort of 2 hyphens, as if the condition has been redacted. So as the reader, we don't know what condition this doctor is talking about. And so this, Martha sort of is quite taken aback at this, because she sort of thinks, oh, I haven't got that. But then as she's having this conversation with the doctor, she starts to realise, and it starts to sort of fall into place to her, that actually he might be right. And what I think is really clever about how this is done is the way that the condition itself is not mentioned, is not specified to us as the reader, means that this never becomes a book about X condition, whatever that might be. It means that the focus remains more on sort of the ripples around that, so the impact of the mental illness on Martha and those around her, rather than it being about X condition. But then what the book also does really well is it's very clear that actually the diagnosis for Martha is incredibly important. And there's a quote sort of in the second half of the book that I wanted to read out, because I thought this just sums it up really. So Martha says, "All the way I thought about my diagnosis, the fact that, in receiving it, the mystery of my existence had been solved. Blank, as in this condition, had determined the course of my life. It had been looked for and never found, guessed about, never correctly, suspected and disqualified, but it had always existed. It had informed every decision I had ever made. It made me act the way I did. It was the cause of my crying. When I screamed at Patrick, it put the words in my mouth. When I threw things, it was blank that raised my arm. I'd had no choice. And every time in the last 2 decades that I'd observed myself and seen a stranger, I had been right. It was never me." And that just sums up how that diagnosis, that final diagnosis, which seems to be the correct diagnosis, is such a pivotal point for Martha. And not only because it means that she then can sort of get the proper help that she needs, can start taking the medication that's properly going to help her, and hopefully, start getting the right treatment. But it means that once she has that diagnosis, she understands what's been going on, for her whole life. And it gives her an explanation and an understanding of why she's felt how she's felt, what has driven her behaviours, what has sort of been almost at the crux of her whole life. But because she's never understood what was going on, she's never had a proper diagnosis or a correct diagnosis. It's just caused even more problems for her. So the diagnosis, while it's not, the specific diagnosis is not important to us as the reader, because it's not about that for us, the diagnosis is absolutely vital to Martha. And then we see the impact that receiving this diagnosis has on Martha's relationships around her. So with her mother, it turns out that there had been another doctor many years ago that had sort of mentioned this condition, and her mother, who had been in the consulting room with her at the time, had sort of like ushered her away, like, no, of course it's not that. And it transpires that the mother has this condition herself and didn't want Martha to be labelled with this condition, and for her to be, to avoid her being stigmatised in that way. So seemingly Martha's mother has sort of acted in what she believes is Martha's best interests, which to a certain extent you could understand, because obviously mental illness is stigmatised, certain conditions more than others. But in doing that, Martha's mother has meant that Martha has just had this whole added confusion, her whole life added into the mix, on top of the mental illness itself. And we also see the impact that the diagnosis has on Martha's relationship with Patrick. So Patrick, her husband, who has just left her at the start of the book. Patrick is a doctor. I can't remember what kind of doctor. He's not a psychiatrist. He's like a sort of some sort of physical health doctor. But Martha cannot believe that Patrick didn't realise that this was the condition that she had. And we see how Patrick does come to admit that he maybe had a little suspicion that that might have been it, but he didn't want to say anything because he was fearful of what the repercussions might be and what might happen as a result of that. This book also looks at issues around motherhood and mental illness. So Martha has always been very clear that she doesn't want children. And when her and Patrick first get together, we see how she's very upfront with him in saying that I don't want children. And he kind of does, but he wants to be with Martha, irrespective of that. What happens when she then eventually gets this diagnosis is there's an almost flippant conversation that happens. The doctor who she sees rings her up, I think, afterwards because he's forgotten to ask her a question. And the question is, I think, is there any chance you could be pregnant, or are you trying to get pregnant or something like that? And she's like, oh no, I know I couldn't because of the medication that I take. And she was told years ago by one of the first doctors she saw when she first started on medication that she mustn't get pregnant because if she did so, medication would harm the fetus. But then when she gets this eventual diagnosis and this doctor has this phone conversation, oh, I should have asked you, is there any chance you could be pregnant? And she's like, oh no, I know I couldn't get, I know not to do that being on medication. And the doctor's like, oh no, I mean, it's fine if you're pregnant, or if you do get pregnant, it's not a problem for you to be on the medication and be pregnant. I just need to ask the question. And this sort of, fairly flippant conversation sort of brings Martha's world crumbling down around her, because it transpires that she has sort of convinced herself and those around her that she doesn't want children, but actually that stems from the fact that she always believed that she mustn't get pregnant because of the medication she takes. And it raises issues around sort of decisions whether to have children and how that intersects with mental illness. So not only, I think, in the case of, medication having an impact, but also genetically passing on things, and also concerns that Martha has around whether she would be fit to be a parent while having a mental illness. So I will admit, actually, that when we get to the bit where it transpires that actually she does really want to be a mother, I was a little bit disappointed, and I'll tell you why. Because I feel like there is a general sort of societal narrative whereby all women want to have children, and even those women who say they don't want to have children, they do really want to have children. And I kind of thought, oh, okay, this is what this is. But actually, within the context of the story and everything, it absolutely makes sense. And I absolutely, of course, think it's a very valid conversation to have. So having this, eventual diagnosis, being on medication that's sort of hopefully potentially gonna work for her in some way. And then towards the end of the book, we see Martha has started writing in a journal, and Patrick, for some reason, happens to read this journal, and this sort of prompts a reconciliation between the two of them. In the journal, Martha has started to write how she has realised that although she's received a diagnosis, and that diagnosis, probably does explain a lot about her life and her behaviour, and like she says, it wasn't me, it was the illness that was sort of driving everything. And while that's still true, she has never really asked Patrick how he is, and has almost sort of forgotten the fact that this has an impact on him as well. And she sort of comes to that realisation towards the end of the book. And then what we see, which I quite liked, thought this was a nice little twist. This book that we've been reading, I think, is this journal that she has been writing, because the journal we see starts with what is the start of the book. So I just thought that was a nice little way of kind of rounding things off. So in summary, I am very pleased that I picked this up again. I really enjoyed it. It wasn't like a perfect book for me, but I think it's quite remarkable in what it manages to do and the tone it manages to achieve, between sort of looking at the more difficult themes but also the humour that runs throughout. I think it is saying some interesting things about the relationship between sort of mental illness and an identity. And I do think it's clever how it manages to sort of avoid focusing on the specifics of a mental illness, more focusing on the impact of that on the individual and on other people. I do think this has had quite a impact on me. It felt like a bit of a gut punch on certainly a couple of occasions, and I think it's a book that I will probably think about quite a lot, and yeah, I mean, that those are all the signs of a good book, aren't they? So yeah, I think it's really great. I think it's got a good chance of winning the Women's Prize. I thought that before I even read it, and having read it, yeah, I do. I think it's got a good chance of winning. I will be doing a predictions video in a couple of weeks' time. I've still got one book to read from the shortlist, but yeah, and if this does win, then I would be very happy with this book as a winner, because I think it would be a deserving winner. Editing Jennifer here, and I just wanted to mention something. So Sorrow and Bliss reminds me of a book which was on last year's Women's Prize shortlist, and that book is No One Is Talking About This by Patricia Lockwood, which I really liked, but I know this book is very divisive, but I do think that Sorrow and Bliss could be divisive in a similar way, but to a lesser extent. I think that stylistically they have things in common. Sorrow and Bliss does have certain sort of short paragraphs which will just be sort of there in isolation, and sometimes it may be just like one sentence by itself. I think tonally both books balance humour with tragedy in quite a similar way, and I think they have voices that are not dissimilar, and I think both explore the sort of interplay between the individual's own internal world versus their external world. So I just thought it was interesting thinking about sort of some of the similarities between the two of them, so I thought I would mention it. Back to yesterday's Jennifer. So yeah, those are my thoughts. Thank you so much for watching. Do let me know if you've read Sorrow and Bliss and what you thought of it. I'd be very interested to know. I hope you're all doing well, and I'll speak to you again very soon. Bye.